During the 1970s, Iran was looking to the West for a lot of its military equipment purchases, and it needed an advanced new fighter to counter reconnaissance flights by MiG-25s that were flying at high altitude over Iranian airspace. After looking at their options, and frankly what the Americans were willing to sell them, Iran placed an order for the F-14 Tomcat and a supply of missiles to go with it. The first deliveries started in 1976, but after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the deal collapsed. The F-14s fell out of service for a year or two as many of the Western-trained pilots either fled the country or were persecuted. But as tensions with Iraq increased, the remaining pilots were reactivated and the F-14s returned to service. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, there was a significant amount of air combat involving traditional dogfights, bomber interception, air cover for ground forces, and so on. These days, decades later, there's a lot of conflicting information about some of the details, but the F-14 was involved in a lot of those combat operations and shot down several dozen aircraft, including fighters and supersonic Tu-22 bombers. Again, sources differ on exact numbers, but most agree that at least 60 or 70 Iraqi aircraft were shot down by the F-14s over the course of the war, against a loss of between 5 and 20 F-14s in combat, and another 5 to 10 in friendly fire accidents or mechanical failures. Since then, Iran has had to rely on the black market and locally produced parts in order to keep their F-14s flying, and again, sources disagree on exactly how many they have operational at any particular moment. But those efforts have included adapting new weapons to fill the gap as they slowly ran out of AIM-54 Phoenix missiles. Programs were launched to integrate the Soviet R-27, and sources disagree if that actually worked, along with an air-launched version of the Hawk surface-to-air missile that did work and was actually used in combat, plus the Fakor 90 missile, which uses the same general shape as the Phoenix so that it can fit the Tomcat, but is produced locally in Iran with a lot of debate and speculation about its exact capabilities. Western sources estimate that as of 2024, Iran has about 20 airworthy F-14s and another 20 in varying stages of repair. What we get in War Thunder is the F-14a IRIAF. This is a jet fighter in rank 8 of the American tree, with a battle rating of 12.3 for air battles and 11.7 for ground. This is the main reward from the Persian Tomcat event in August of 2024. Since a lot of players might get this jet without having much experience with high-tier jet fighters, I'll be going into a little more detail than usual in this review. This plane has a full ballistics computer, including the EEGS for easier gunfighting, and it carries the AN/ALR-45V radar warning receiver. This unit picks up E through J bands, but only has entry-level threat detection. If you need more info about how to read the scope or anything, I'll put a link in a pinned comment to my guide on radar warning receivers. The radar this jet carries is the AN/AWG-9. This is a fairly long-range set with both head-on and head-on velocity pulse Doppler modes. It supports track-wall scan and multiple ACM frames, as well as 6 data link channels. For loadouts, this F-14 gets a pretty wide selection of air-to-air missiles, along with a reasonable selection of dumb bombs and unguided rockets. The close-in dogfighting missile is the AIM-9P, an export version of the Sidewinder. This is a rear-aspect infrared missile with 20 Gs of pull and fairly average performance overall. This is the only heat seeker you get, so you may come to rely on it pretty heavily for close-in fighting. For semi-active radar missiles, there are 3 options: the AIM-7E2 Sparrow, the R-27R1, and the Segil. The AIM-7E2 has fairly medium performance overall, but it has the advantage that you can take a lot more of them. It's got 25 Gs of pull, and it works well in head-on attacks or medium-range deflection shots, thanks to its good acceleration. The R-27R1 is a bit more of an advanced weapon, with inertial guidance and data link support. This allows the weapon to keep going if you lose your radar lock for a few seconds, and it can reacquire its target fairly quickly thanks to the data link. It's also got a larger warhead than the Sparrow, but its initial acceleration is a little slower. It's a great weapon for medium-range shots, but really only average at close range. The Sigil is new to War Thunder, and it's an air-to-air version of the Hawk surface-to-air missile. It only has 15 Gs of pull and average tracking, but it's got very good range thanks to a strong rocket motor, and it has an absolutely enormous warhead. Now, despite the low maximum G-pull, the insane energy of this missile lets it maneuver a lot better than you would expect at medium ranges. But it's really not well suited for close-in shots, as the Seeker doesn't start tracking for over a second after you fire it. The R-27 is usually going to be the better bet for close-up radar shots. Your first active radar missile is the F-14a Phoenix. This is a long-range missile best used against targets that really aren't maneuvering too much. It supports inertial guidance and data link, but it's fairly slow to accelerate and can be very easy to dodge if the opponent knows that it's coming. The new active radar missile is the Fakor 90. Compared to the Phoenix, it's a bit heavier, but it's got a stronger rocket motor with a long-lasting sustainer similar to the Sigil, which allows it to have more efficient use of energy and an artificially increased ability to maneuver at medium ranges. Also, like the Sigil, not great for close-in shots. In terms of its flight performance, the F-14a combines good energy power and variable geometry wings. Now, this is a large and heavy jet, so if you haven't flown something like this before, get ready for a learning curve. A few things up front. The rate of climb and top-end speed of this jet are a little above average for this BR, depending on fuel weight and weapon load. But the acceleration isn't as good as a lot of the single-engined lighter jets that you're going to get paired with. Honestly, though, it's still perfectly fine. The energy retention at most airspeeds is pretty good, but if you want to focus on agility, it's important to monitor that airspeed very closely. For best dogfight performance, you want to try and be in between about 575 and 775 kilometers an hour, with at least half of your fuel burned off. In fact, managing fuel weight becomes a somewhat important game mechanic once you get into these Mach 2 jets that tend to carry an enormous amount of gas in order to feed those afterburners. As a related concern, the energy retention in purely vertical maneuvers, like loops or a straight vertical zoom climb, tends to lag a bit behind lighter fighters, so do try to keep that in mind. The high yo-yo remains a pretty strong maneuver though for keeping your energy up while attacking a slower opponent, but just don't let them suck you into vertical scissors or something. Now this brings us to the wing sweep. There are two schools of thought on this. Mainly, if you should leave the wing sweep on automatic or set some keybinds for manual control. For my 5 cents, there's a time and a place for both. I'm gonna oversimplify this a bit, but in short, you want to have the wings unswept for dogfighting and swept for high-speed flight. The automatic control does a fairly good job at managing this, but it can help to set it on manual and keep the wings unswept, or mostly unswept, if you're trying to focus in on agility in a dogfight, so that the plane will use its energy for turning instead of sweeping the wings and trying to accelerate better at the expense of agility. If you use the automatic control and you're having trouble in turning dogfights, try switching it to manual and see how it goes for you. Now, when you take this jet up into air battles, it can be tempting at first to just start throwing off your active radar missiles on yeet shots halfway across the map. You can, and I'll confess that I do too sometimes, but just remember that the vast majority of those kind of shots are gonna miss. Seriously, if you get 1 hit out of 4 on those long-range shots over 50 kilometers, that was a pretty good result. The Fakor and Phoenix are both pretty easy to dodge at longer ranges, and for best results, you generally want to fire them between around 25 to 35 kilometers an hour, but even then, they're still fairly simple to evade if somebody knows the shot is coming. Have fun with them, but just don't expect miracles. Another consideration is that long-range missiles have a pretty long flight time, and it can take almost a minute for the missile to reach its targets out at longer ranges. And this plane's targeting system doesn't give you the impact countdown, so it's sometimes difficult to determine if you've missed or you just need to wait another 5 seconds. If you want to keep the data links up and track while the active radar missiles are going in, you need to decline targeting closer threats with a conventional radar lock. If you're willing to abandon the data link to lock a closer target for a semi-active radar shot, then it's no big deal. But just keep in mind that it's a trade-off and an opportunity cost if you want to keep the data link going as other targets get closer and become threats. Now, when it comes to dogfighting, the AIM-9P is a fairly average missile overall, and it performs probably a little below average for this tier, considering that you can go up against R-73s. You get the EEGS for the cannon, so if you want to get into a gunfight, it's worth trying to get radar locks. But just remember that the F-14 is a heavy jet, and if you haven't burnt off at least half of your fuel weight, a lot of your opponents are going to be able to outmaneuver you unless your ACM is just flawless. Also, don't forget to think about that manual wing sweep control if you're struggling in turn fights. The last consideration is the radar. The AWG-9 is great at long range, but up close it can have some serious issues because it only has head-on look-down modes, and it really struggles to lock targets under about 12 kilometers. If you're using ACM targeting and you're having trouble locking stuff, try manually cycling from HDN to regular SRC. More ground clutter, but no short-range dead zone. In terms of ground attack, this is another jet where I'm gonna say you really shouldn't bother in air battles, but flying close air support, the new YASA rockets can be pretty strong. Now, as of making this review, they have a very sensitive proximity fuse, so I'm going to strongly suggest trying to use them in top-down shots so that they don't proxy off the ground or a tree before they get in range of the target. That behavior may or may not get patched out at some point. Visually, it's a Tomcat, and it's badass. You get a couple of skins for it that look great, and the addition of the non-standard weapons out on the wing glove pylons really stands out. Overall, this is a great-looking jet. Landing is fairly basic, but this jet doesn't have a drag chute, so try to touch down a little slower. You can drop gear at about 500 kilometers an hour and landing flaps at about 400, but only if the wings are all the way forward. Mostly docile landing performance, but it's going to have a long landing run if you come in a little hot. The cockpit on this jet is generally pretty good. It's got strong all-around visibility and clear instruments, but the HUD is a little simplistic and the radar scope is lower than I personally prefer. Still, it's more than good enough, and I did have a fun time with it in VR. To close out on the Iranian F-14a. This jet has very long-range radar missiles, a high quantity of missiles, a long-range radar set to go with them, good flight performance, and a fully featured ballistics computer. However, its radar can struggle at close range, it can run out of countermeasures pretty quickly, and it lacks an all-aspect dogfighting missile. The final verdict on the Iranian F-14 is that this jet is a great event prize, an interesting version of a plane that's already in the game that people can get without having to grind up the entire tech tree. With a little practice, it's a lot of fun to fly, but if you did skip the tech tree and have mostly flown like props and stuff, just be realistic and expect a learning curve when you jump into this thing. As always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, check out this other one.